Why? Every productivity system you've ever used is a broken copy of something for older. The most influential self-improvement system in the Western world was written in secret, in a language the author didn't grow up speaking, with no intention of ever being read. And the man who wrote it governed 70 million people while doing it. That detail alone should stop you. Because the entire American productivity industry, the morning routines, the habit stacks, the discipline frameworks, the mindset architectures, all of it traces back knowingly or not to a Roman emperor who sat alone in a military tent along the Danube River and wrote notes to himself that he never planned to publish. Notes he titled, in Greek, simply, to himself. The self-improvement market has built a multi-billion-dollar industry on the promise that discipline is a system you can purchase, install, and run. Buy the planner, follow the protocol, stack the habits, execute the morning routine. The implicit assumption underneath all of it is that discipline is a technology problem. Find the right tool, and the right behavior follows. Marcus Aurelius operated from a completely different premise, and the gap between his premise and the one the market sells you is the reason most discipline systems work for 3 weeks and then collapse under the first real pressure test. Here is the core paradox that this investigation will unpack. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He commanded the largest military force in the Western world. He controlled the legal, economic, and political fate of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. And the system he used to stay functional, clear, and consistent under that weight was not a productivity hack. It was not a morning routine. It was not a framework you could buy, brand, or bottle. It was a nightly interrogation of his own failures, written in private, shared with no one. The pattern interrupt here is historical and precise. The Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD had no shortage of powerful men who collapsed under power. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, who came immediately after Marcus and spent his reign dressing as Hercules and fighting gladiators in the arena. Absolute authority, in nearly every historical case, produces predictable psychological deterioration. Marcus Aurelius is the documented exception, and the only variable the historical record can point to is the practice he maintained in private, every single night, for decades. That practice is what this investigation is about, not the philosophy, not the quotes that circulate on social media. The actual operational system, what it looked like, why it worked, and why the version of it that the self-improvement industry sells you is missing the one element that made it functional. If this is the kind of investigation you want more of, the subscribe button keeps the next one in your feed. What made Marcus Aurelius different was not what he believed. It was what he did with what he believed, alone, in the dark, before the empire required anything of him. What the Meditations actually are, and why that changes everything. Most people who reference the Meditations have never read them with this question in mind. What problem was this man actually trying to solve? Read them as philosophy, and they feel like timeless wisdom. Read them as a repair log, which is closer to what they actually are, and something else entirely comes into focus. Marcus Aurelius was not writing insights. He was debugging a mind under extreme operational load. The difference between those two framings is the difference between admiring the document and understanding what it was built to do. The Meditations are structured in 12 books, likely written across multiple years, with significant portions composed during the Marcomannic Wars along the Danube, roughly between 170 and 180 AD. This is not a trivial detail. These were not reflective years. They were crisis years. A plague had already killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire. Roman legions were engaged in sustained, brutal warfare against Germanic tribes that had, for the first time in centuries, crossed the Danube into Roman territory. Marcus was managing battlefield strategy, plague, logistics, political succession, and personal grief simultaneously. He buried most of his children. He buried 2 of his closest advisors. And in the middle of all of that, he kept writing to himself, in Greek, about whether he was thinking clearly. The pattern interrupt here comes from a domain the viewer would not expect: software engineering. In modern software development, there is a practice called a postmortem, a structured review conducted after a system failure to identify what broke, why it broke, and what change prevents it from breaking the same way again. The practice is deliberately unemotional. The goal is not to assign blame. The goal is to identify the pattern that produced the failure so the system can be patched before the next deployment. Marcus Aurelius was running postmortems on his own mind in 170 AD. The entries in the Meditations follow a recognizable structure: identification of a recurring failure pattern, analysis of the thinking that produced it, and a corrective instruction directed at himself, in the second person, with no softening. He does not write, "I sometimes struggle with impatience." He writes, in direct address to himself, something closer to, "You acted as though their opinion of you mattered." It does not correct this. This is not motivational writing. This is systems maintenance. And the reason it produced the behavioral consistency that historians document across Marcus's reign is precisely because it was not designed to inspire. It was designed to install. The American self-improvement market sells inspiration. Marcus Aurelius built installation. The gap between those two words is the gap between a system that works for a weekend and a system that works for 18 years under maximum pressure. What system are you running right now? When things break, drop it in the comments. Not what you think you should be running. What actually happens in your mind when a decision goes wrong and the pressure is real. The deeper question is not what Marcus wrote. It is what the act of writing it, privately, repetitively, and without any external audience, did to the architecture of his decision-making over time. How a man who governed an empire trained himself to need almost nothing from it. There is a concept in elite military training that most civilians never encounter, called stress inoculation. The principle is straightforward and the application is brutal. You expose a person to controlled doses of the exact stressors they will face in the field, not to toughen them emotionally, but to pre-encode the correct response, so that when the real situation arrives, the nervous system does not have to improvise. The response has already been installed. The body already knows what to do. Marcus Aurelius had no access to that term, but the practice he ran every night in the Meditations is functionally identical to stress inoculation applied to the mind. He called it, in Stoic terminology, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversities. Before each day began, he rehearsed everything that could go wrong. Specific things, not abstract catastrophizing. The ungrateful person he would encounter, the advisor who would give him bad counsel, the moment when his temper would be tested and the cost of losing it would be high. He ran the scenario in advance so that when it arrived into a prepared system, not a surprised one. The historical case study that makes this concrete is one that most American audiences know by outcome, but have never examined by mechanism. Bill Clinton has publicly stated that he returned to Marcus Aurelius repeatedly throughout his presidency, not for comfort, not for inspiration, for operational recalibration. A sitting president of the United States, managing the most complex decision environment on the planet, reaching back 18 centuries to read the private notes of a Roman emperor who governed an equally complex decision environment, and left behind the only detailed record we have of how he kept his own thinking clean. The pattern interrupt here is scale. Clinton did not read the Meditations because they were beautiful. He read them because they were functional. Because the problems Marcus was solving, how to maintain judgment under political pressure, how to act on principle when self-interest argues the other direction, how to process loss without allowing it to corrupt decision-making are not Roman problems. They are structural problems of anyone who operates with significant responsibility under sustained pressure. The mechanism that makes stress inoculation work in military training, and that made premeditatio malorum work for Marcus, is the same mechanism. It separates the experience of a stressor from the novelty of encountering it for the first time. When something is no longer new, it is no longer as cognitively expensive. The emotional load drops. The quality of the response improves, not because you stopped caring, because you already processed it before it happened. This is what peak performance psychology now calls cognitive reappraisal, and it is one of the most robustly documented predictors of high performance under pressure in the research literature on elite athletes, special operations personnel, and senior executives. The science is recent, the system is ancient, and the man who ran it most consistently left detailed documentation of exactly how he did it, in a document he addressed to no one but himself. If what you're discovering here is worth your time, the light tells the algorithm to put this in front of someone else who needs it. The most counterintuitive part of Marcus's system is not what it required him to do. It is what it required him to stop needing. The one variable the self-improvement industry cannot sell you, and why that is the point. Here is the detail about Marcus Aurelius that no productivity course will ever turn into a framework, because it cannot be packaged, monetized, or made aspirational in the way the market requires. Marcus Aurelius did not want to be remembered. This is not a rhetorical point. It is documented repeatedly in the Meditations themselves. He writes about Alexander the Great and his generals all being equally dissolved by time. He writes about the emperors before him, men whose names filled the empire, as figures now reduced to dust and story. He writes about his own reign in the same terms. Not with despair, with precision, with the specific intention of stripping away the psychological weight of legacy building so that the full capacity of his attention could be directed at the only thing that was actually within his control, the quality of his thinking and the integrity of his actions in the present moment. The pattern interrupt here is identity level, and it is the deepest one in this investigation. The entire architecture of American high-performance culture is built on the foundation of legacy. Build something that lasts. Leave your mark. Be remembered. These are not just cultural preferences. They are the emotional engine that most productivity systems run on. The desire for significance is the fuel. The system is the delivery mechanism for that fuel. Marcus Aurelius removed the fuel entirely, and what remained was something the research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation has been trying to describe in clinical language for 60 years. Behavior that is fully anchored to internal values rather than external outcomes. When there is no audience, there is no performance. When there is no performance, there is no gap between who you are and how you act. That gap, between the private self and the public performance, is where most people's discipline breaks down, not from lack of willpower, from the cognitive and emotional cost of managing that gap continuously under pressure. The historical evidence for what the elimination of that gap produces is Marcus Aurelius himself. 18 years as emperor, wars, plague, personal catastrophe, betrayal by people he trusted, the structural corruption that attaches itself to power at every level, and through all of it, the documented consistency of a man who had, by every account available to historians, no serious distance between what he believed and how he acted. His Stoic teacher Epictetus, whose lectures Marcus studied, never met a student who had done more with less theater. The depth of this is worth sitting with, because it has a direct implication for anyone operating in the current attention economy. The systems that the most visible high performers use today, the personal branding, the public accountability, the documented morning routines, are all externally anchored. They derive their energy from an audience. Remove the audience, and the system has no power source. Marcus built a system that derived its energy from the complete removal of the audience, including the internal audience of ego. That system is not for everyone. It is not easy to want, but understanding its structure changes what questions you ask about your own discipline, and why it holds in some situations and collapses in others. What this means for anyone making high-stakes decisions in the age of maximum distraction. The environment you operate in right now was specifically designed to erode your decision-making capacity, gradually and invisibly, through continuous fragmentation of attention. This is not metaphor. Every major platform you interact with daily was engineered to maximize your time in reactive processing rather than deliberate thinking. Reactive processing is faster and more profitable for the platforms. It is also the exact opposite of the cognitive state required for high-stakes decisions or any form of sustained mental discipline. Marcus Aurelius faced a structurally similar problem with different mechanics. The Roman court was an attention fragmentation machine. Petitioners, political theater, ceremonial demands, and the social performance that came with the highest office in the known world. His nightly writing practice was not a luxury. It was a recalibration mechanism, a deliberate return to his own criteria, in his own language, before the environment could overwrite them again. The pattern interrupt here is practical and immediate. His system was not built for silence or ideal conditions. It was built specifically for maximum operational noise. That is the detail the self-help industry consistently strips from the Stoic tradition when packaging it for modern audiences. The meditations were not written in a monastery. They were written during active military campaigns. The system works in the noise because it was designed inside the noise. The modern application has three components drawn directly from what the meditations document as operational practice. The first is anticipatory specificity. Before any high-pressure situation, a precise mental rehearsal of the exact moment where your judgment typically degrades, and what the correct action looks like at that moment. Not a general intention to perform well, a specific pre-loaded response. The second is a daily error review without emotional weight, a brief accounting of where your behavior diverged from your stated values, conducted with the neutrality of an engineer reading a performance log, not a judge reviewing a verdict. The third is the deliberate narrowing of attention to the controllable, the active practice of returning cognitive resources to what you can act on and releasing the processing load attached to what you cannot. In the current landscape of artificial intelligence, compressed decision cycles, and accelerating operational demands, the capacity for quality judgment under pressure has never been more valuable or more difficult to maintain. The tools are faster, the data is larger, the windows for deliberate thinking are smaller, and the internal capacity that separates a decision that holds from one that doesn't is not built by faster tools. It is built the same way it was built, in a military tent on the Danube in 170 AD. Marcus Aurelius wrote to no one. That is precisely why what he wrote survived. A system that performs identically whether anyone is watching or not is the only system that holds when the pressure is real and the stakes are high. This investigation has only opened the first layer. There is a deeper structure beneath what Marcus built, one that predates him by 4 centuries, designed for people operating under conditions of total uncertainty with no institutional support. That structure is where the real architecture lives, and it begins somewhere you would not expect. If what you found here shifted something in how you think about mental discipline and high performance, the subscription keeps the next investigation in your feed. Hit the bell. The next video goes directly into that structure. One specific question: think of one decision you made in the last 30 days that you would have made differently with Marcus's premeditation system running. Not a general reflection. One specific decision. Put it in the comments. That kind of concrete thinking is what separates people who consume ideas from people who install them. The system has been sitting in plain sight for 18 centuries. Most people who encounter it see philosophy. A small number see something else entirely.